Gentlemen, this is Dr. Daria Brzezinski with Children Come First, and this morning we are privileged to have Congressman Paul Kanjorsky from the Congressional District, the 11th Congressional District, which encompasses Columbia, Luzerne, Monroe, Carbon, Northumberland, Montour, and other counties. And we'd like to talk a little bit about education and some of the issues regarding education at the federal level. Congressman Kanjorski, good morning. Can you describe your general approach to improving education?
Well, I think that what we have to do is recognize there are different needs in different areas, but there are also some very common areas that seem to be rather universal, and one of that is class size. So that we're making a real effort to try and reduce the class size first through third grade throughout the country to capture these young minds at their most formative period of time. And that's why we put a lot of emphasis in the 100,000 new teachers. Then there are needs throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the country for new structures and facilities. So we have also a construction bond issue, attempt to raise about $25 billion for new schools. It's not for the bricks and mortars as much as for the equipment and the updating. I think now 47 of the 50 states have internet accessibility in their schools, and that's very important, that every young kid, regardless of what area they come from, that they get on to the most modern technology that's moving our 21st century. And that's particularly important in northeastern Pennsylvania, that we make sure that each student gets that type of exposure. And then finally, I think we have to look at the quality of education, make sure that the teachers that are put in the classroom have their emphasis and focus on the subject they're teaching, particularly in math, science, and some of these fundamental subjects. And then finally, after that, I look at focusing very directly on getting parental association with the student, because I find in interviewing a lot of students that visit me here in Washington that when we cut to the chase as to what made them a good student and what gave them an ambition to go on to higher education, it's generally the response they have to the support they get from their parent or parents. And it doesn't matter whether the child comes from a single parent home or a two-parent home. It's the fact that the parents pay so much attention. And I think we see that in the parochial school system to a large extent. Not that they aren't doing other things that are important to education, but one of the fundamental support systems in that structure is the fact that the parents spend a great deal of time, effort, and focus with the children. And we have to bring that type of process to the public school system. And I think if we do all of those things, we're certainly likely to improve the quality of our students, and that's where our emphasis should be, on quality students.
Now, what are some of the primary proposals that are in education today that you feel are fundamental to changes, especially in the state of Pennsylvania?
Well, I think we're getting in the area where the American people are recognizing that there's a need for some federal commitment to education as well as local and state commitment. So we certainly are enlarging the amount of funds that will flow into these states. But the important thing is that we get a handle on the success and to be able to test for success, as opposed in the past we just forwarded funds in the nature of specific grants, but we had no testing capacity and accountability. And I think now that we do have to make an emphasis for quality education and getting an accountability, that in fact that's being accomplished, so that we can weed out the bad projects and programs and emphasize the more successful ones. And I think building in flexibility in education is another major factor that, as a matter of maturity, the federal government has to recognize that we can't just specifically channel funds, but we have to give flexibility at both the state and at the local school board level. And I think we're learning how to do that in a new way. Hopefully, this presidential election will make education one of the major issues in the United States in the presidential election, and maybe we'll get a commitment from both the presidential candidates to make much larger commitments personally in their leadership of the country toward education. That's going to be very fundamental. So if I had to say whether I'm positive or negative as to where we're going, I'm very positive. I think the country is heading in the right direction. Probably a little frustrated we're not doing it as fast enough.
Those are some of my questions, actually. But let's get back to one of the issues you just stated first. What do you see? Most of our listening audience doesn't understand, I have discovered, how government works. And for example, they don't understand the difference between the state government and the federal government with regard to legislation. And they keep hearing everyone talk about how we need to get more local. And then we hear you talking about funding more programs. And so please elaborate for our listening audience how the federal government delineates itself from the state government, from the local government with regard to education.
Well, that's a very good question, Doctor. We have to recognize that most of education in the United States is delivered at the school board level. But the school board level, for purposes of how they perform their work, they're under state guidelines, the state legislature. So really the state legislature passes the appropriations as the state participates. I think in Pennsylvania it's almost 37% of the cost of education per student. That's reimbursed. But then there are guidelines set down both by the legislative acts and by the rules and regulations of the Secretary of Education of the state. The school boards have to conform to that area. Then another layer on top of that expenditure, and that expenditure, school board level and state level, probably accounts for a little over $300 billion, certainly the major contribution in the United States. And then the federal government comes in really with a small fraction of that, somewhere between 8 and 10% of additional funding, about $30 billion for the whole country. That is on a targeted area. And what that attempts to do is encourage the states to have not the same standards, but similar standards, so that our student that's educated in Mississippi can just as easily perform functions in California, or our student that's educated in Pennsylvania can perform functions in Michigan. And that requires some standardization of programs, and that's coordinated to a large extent by the individual states getting together in conferences, and then the federal government, where it sees real weaknesses, to come in and add additional assistance there. And an example of that, just recently when I traveled this summer with the president, one of the stops we made was in the Delta of Mississippi. And the question that the people put to us as to why they're a distressed economic area is that we found that 56% of their students left school in their sophomore year in high school. And when you think about that, in the year 2000, that more than 50% of the student body never completes the junior or senior year of high school, no less technical school or college or undergraduate school. You can see this how disadvantaged they are in the workplace, what limitations that community has to attract the higher technical jobs and skills that would be necessary. So in an area like that, we concentrate in the federal government in grants to provide the extra impetus to get these students to stay in school at least through high school graduation, and then some technical training or other assistance to encourage you to see what the opportunities nationwide. Because when a student only goes through a sophomore year in high school, it's highly unlikely that they'll ever live beyond 30-mile radius of where they're born. They really can't function outside of that area. They just don't have the knowledge, they don't have the information, and certainly they don't have the self-esteem to handle themselves sometimes in the entire country, no less the whole world. So you run into a problem like that. Then you'll run into other problems where they have a traditional educational system but aren't necessarily teaching children how to use a computer. And when the federal government sees that, we have special programs that can help those school districts access the computer. And we have a uniform program with the FCC that allows all schools to have a grant program, a sports system, a lesser cost of getting onto the internet. And we've utilized that in northeastern Pennsylvania very well. Almost every school district has received some subsidy toward getting on the internet. So as I look at it, the federal government sort of works as an assister to help out in particular areas and try and keep the whole country watching itself so it has a uniform currency, if you will, in education. The states have the burden of establishing the basic education, and unfortunately the taxes are called for from the local real estate market in most instances. They aren't well distributed, and so those are some of the things that we're encouraging states to look at. Now, I happen to be a supporter of Governor Florio's program in New Jersey, where they decided that it was really grossly unfair to spend $3,000 on a child in one district and $12,000 in another district nearby. That it was an imbalance of substance that the child was getting, both in skill of faculty, materials, laboratories to deal with, and physical plant. So he uniformed in New Jersey that every student, regardless of what area they come from, are entitled to the same amount of subsidy through the state. Pennsylvania doesn't have that program, and it works to a great disadvantage of rural areas and distressed economic areas. And Pennsylvania, of course, has a lot of distressed areas where there's an elderly population and a loss of tax base as a result, and as a result of that, insufficient amount of funds to support the type of education we need. So it's areas that we accommodate by having programs that encourage that national scope of the states and the school districts getting together in seminars and conventions to see what other states are doing and trying to take the best practices. Other than that, the federal government really is not playing that big a monetary role at this point in education. But I think it is playing a big role in standardization and accountability. And I think that's very important. And to many instances, when I spend time with parents in my district, they want their child to have an equal opportunity of the best schooling they can possibly have is equal to every other public school education of every other child in the country. And I think that's our formula, to give equal education and to give a quality equal education.
You are listening to Children Come First. This is Dr. Daria Brzezinski. We're here today with Congressman Paul Kanjorsky from the 11th Congressional District, and we're talking about education at the federal level. And you alluded to something very briefly that I have about 5 or 6 questions about some of the things that you talked about. And one is there is much discussion, because I have been at the state level regarding unfunded mandates. Specifically, we'll talk about the special education funding. And there is tremendous turmoil going on with regard to the handicap legislation for many school districts who have to pay, some of them, $60,000 to $100,000 per child because of legislative mandates. And obviously nobody at the federal level is going to commit political suicide by trying to retract whatever we've done. So how can we help the districts, or what can we do with these unfunded mandates in terms of alleviating some of the problems at the state level?
Well, most of the superintendents and principals that I meet with feel that sometimes the legislation itself and the rules and regulations to implement the legislation have been too broad and too encompassing to almost encourage some system-wise parents to advantage something that wasn't intended to be advantaged, and at a great cost to the individual school districts. I think we have to look into that, and I think we have to trust those people at the delivery level that their intentions are good, they want to deliver a quality education, but they can't be so bound by either the judicial process and legal process that they get misused or abused. It's an interesting point, because I think in the disadvantaged child in the school system in New York City costs that system on average $78,000 per child. That's like 5 times, 6 times, well, probably maybe even 7 times what they're paying per other student. And to a large extent, because of limited funds, it means sometimes programs and projects and materials are reduced that are absolutely essential for quality education for the general population mass in order to meet this mandate. So I think we have to be sensitive to it. I don't think we should go back and deny it, because to a large extent it was passed for the purposes of providing things that were absolutely denied to some children that needed special services. But unfortunately, like all things that are done with good intentions, sometimes a small minority of parents will abuse it, or other people will abuse it at a great cost to the system. So it's one of those fairness issues that we have to work with the local administrators and the people that are in touch with what's going on a day-to-day basis, and make sure that we don't make these laws so full of loopholes that some people can abuse them.
But is it ever possible to really do that? I mean, you are working with, I have spoken to I've interviewed legislators at the state level regarding this as well. And if we look just at the state of Pennsylvania alone, Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, and Philadelphia are certainly have far different needs than Luzerne County, and even within Luzerne County itself, Dallas School District and Nanticoke School District are very different. So how can government really look at such diversity and ever try to encompass, and what are the answers to that in terms of encompassing such diversity, not only within a state but within the nation as well?
Extremely difficult, almost impossible. I think the first rule, and one of the things I learned when I first got elected to Congress, is don't try and find perfection because you just can't find it. I think what we have to do is find reasonableness. And it seems to me that when looking around, there are some good examples of good practices. And as I cited, the New Jersey system of state funding across the board seems to provide, at least from a financial standpoint, the ability to have the same type of education as other areas. That doesn't guarantee one child the same education as in another district, because the faculty may be different, the physical plant may be different, just the basic abilities or the intentions of the people involved in education may be different. But certainly in funding, we can try and get a little more equality. Then finally, try and encourage our best and brightest to remain in the teaching profession. I mean, as you and I know, we're bleeding right now, particularly with a tremendous economy of so many people that would normally have chosen education or would like to choose education as their vocation in life, that end up going into other challenging fields, sometimes driven by the economics involved. So there's a whole tendency to try and play down the value of teachers and educators, but quite frankly, they're the ones that are creating the investment of our future as a nation and as a society and a culture. So I think we should try and cool down that antagonism between the average population and the people that have chosen the teaching profession. Because quite frankly, what we want to do is encourage people who have much greater abilities to do almost anything, to still come back and concentrate in education so we can get the best and brightest as our teachers, so we create the best students for the future.
Now, you are absolutely correct. This is not just in Pennsylvania, but this is nationwide. We have a very, very deep shortage, especially around the coastal areas around the United States, and in our high-risk areas, in our in the areas where there's much violence in major cities as well. Is there anything, what can we do to bring people back to this profession? I mean, we call it a profession, but I often wonder if we really look at it as a profession as we might do physicians or attorneys. We really don't look at the teaching profession as it is when we consider that, especially with the time, we know from research that the most critical time in a child's life are the first 6 years of their life, and yet in daycares we pay people minimum wage, and we have very low standards, and yet we know that those are the most critical times of. And who can we hire at minimum wage but the most minimal kinds of employees? And I don't mean to debase people who are daycare teachers, because I was one myself. However, we really don't look at the teaching profession as something that's actually, we don't look at the parenting profession as well in our country either, in terms of something that is significantly important. How can we draw more bright professionals into what can we do to alleviate this burden and this problem before it gets even worse than it is today?
Well, as an individual comes from a family that only had two choices in life, be a lawyer or a teacher. My mother, my wife, my sisters are teachers, and my brother and I and my father and uncle were all lawyers. I have a high regard for educators simply because I've had the occasion to be around them a lot. I know how much effort it takes, and I know what they give up, not only in their remuneration in life, but also in time. And if they're very dedicated, they have a high tendency to burn out, quite frankly. But I think the first way to start is let's not have as much bashing as we have at all levels. Two, let's not fail to recognize that there are efficiencies that can be put into place, particularly with the internet and the computer operation, that higher pay and higher qualifications in teachers can be called for and provided with sometimes less expense, because we can manage and handle the situation in a different way. But quite frankly, there are those formative ages that are very important. We know that Head Start has been a tremendous success for disadvantaged students, and we're striving as hard as we can to get total Head Start started. I think you put your hand on a real problem in daycare, because to a large extent, these are middle-class families that can't get Head Start, and yet some of their children 8 hours a day are not getting people who are trained in the educational profession or necessarily sympathetic toward education, and that's so formidably important. I think we have to upgrade those areas and recognize that these are not areas that can be left to least common denominator or least payment for services. Now, can we afford to do both things? It's not easy. But certainly worth paying attention to. And that's why I supported the president's efforts to put 100,000 school teachers, particularly in the first 3 grades, because I, individually, have had a personal experience with that. I suffer from a reading disability and couldn't read until I was in 4th grade. And quite frankly, if I hadn't had a mother that was a teacher and some sympathetic sisters, I probably would have never learned to read in my entire life with dyslexia. But they diagnosed it when nobody knew what it was, worked with me, and I was able to learn how to read in a different way. Up until that time, it was just a matter of memorizing each word, but not really understanding how to get there. A lot of children suffer from some of these disabilities or limitations, and if you don't have people that are sensitive and talented in diagnosing these problems, they go undiagnosed, and at a certain point it's very difficult to then make the correction when the child becomes above 10, 12. It's almost a lost child, and some of these people can be very huge contributors to our future. I mean, they're very creative people. They have all the capacity, but sometimes they have some learning disability that has to be diagnosed and then treated in a way, and they have to be reached, if you will. And that takes not only talent as a teacher, but sensitivity as a human being to see that that's there and how you get to it.
Well, we have something in common. I was dyslexic too. It took my mother, who who paid attention to me, to be able to get me through that as well. So, and I also had one of my younger brothers who had a problem as well, and my mother picked it out, and now that's my brother Mark. So I understand what you mean when you have, parents. There's another issue here that we've been kind of dancing around with regard to education, and you talked about it earlier, but how can we get parents more involved? It is absolutely critical. With 2 parents working, with children going into daycare from 6 weeks at 6 weeks after birth on, how can we get parents more involved we know that that's important. You and I both know that, and so does research shows it as well. How can we encourage parents to become, and how can we get them into the educational system when both mother and father have to work in this day and age?
Well, we have some portion of the population that sometimes both parents don't have to work. It's a choice and not a necessity. Sometimes I urge those people who can afford to have either a mother or a father assume more of a parental full-time role to think about that as one of the investments you make if you want to have children. But that doesn't cover the large portion of the population that almost by necessity, both parents today are required to work to meet the middle-class standard of living. Or single mothers, right. And to those individuals, we really have to work on providing a level of income and encourage them to rise to a level of income and distribution of income in the system that gives them that area where they get out of total anxiety. There's nothing more fearful than living from check to check, that every contingency or crisis can strike the family down. And there's so many Americans that have that problem. But usually even parents that have 2 jobs, and I've found many of them, that have all kinds of commitments to the community, if they do get well organized and they really want to be hard parents, and they have some support system sometimes from their parents or their uncles and aunts, an awful lot of substance can come and help from the family unit itself. And it usually is the one key factor that successful students cite to me, that there was a crisis time in their life and somebody was there, either a parent or a family member, to reach out and help them and show that they had a tremendous interest, and that was the stimulus that made these people go on and succeed very well. So I think it's doable. And then I would just urge too, people should consider when they're having a family. That's a major investment. It's just not having a child. A child just begins as a raw mass of cells. You've got a commitment there then to nurture that child into a human being at least equal to yourself and hopefully better. And if every generation we do that, we'll become better as a society every generation, and that's what we should strive for. I notice that in good economic times, the stress and strain on families seems to be less, and more devotion and attention is being paid to children. And I think that really accounts for our reduction in crime, our reduction in a lot of difficulties, teen pregnancies, and everything else that's been occurring over the last 7 years is almost directly attributable to this improvement in the economy. Because regardless of how people argue it, if you don't have the means to exist as a family or as an individual, there's not an awful lot more that you can put to someone else until you take care of those basic means. So hopefully we'll keep improving the economy and making sure the benefits of a wealthier and richer economy are more adequately spread among the general masses of the people, so that that anxiety level can go down and that parents can do what parents naturally do, nurture and love their children.
with Dr. Darya Brzezinski and Children Come First. We're here with Congressman Paul Kanjorsky from the 11th Congressional District in Pennsylvania, and we're talking about education in general and especially at the legislative level. Now, with the internet so pervasive in everything that we do, and I'm thinking about specifically higher education these days. It is so much easier to do the internet and take courses through the internet, and you can get high quality courses from major universities through the internet now at half the price or even less of what it would be to participate in our institutions of higher learning. And specifically, we were talking with the president of Wilkes University the other day, who was talking about how the struggling institutions have to deal with paying professionals to work and all the other overhead that has to do with going to school on a facility. How do you see the internet impacting institutions, especially those in your congressional district, like Wilkes and King's, College Mr. Cordia, Scranton University, Penn State, and those? What do you think? How do you see that for the future?
Well, I look at the revolution with the internet as something that offers an opportunity in this decade and this generation that's never existed in the world before. Let me go back a little bit. If you look at Western civilization, the sign and determination of an educated man was usually determined on the size of their library. If you lived around the time of Thomas Jefferson, and if you had a 20,000 volume library, you were considered an enlightened, reasonable Renaissance man. And now, anyone who can access the internet literally can have the Library of Congress as their library. So we've equalized the separation between the need for wealth and volumes of books to expose people to education. And so we've created here an egalitarian educational system that has never existed in the world before. And people can make huge jumps in advancement, either through their family structure, be the first to get a college education or a graduate degree, and go on to do very challenging things that weren't even thought of in the last generation. But I particularly am impressed. A local young billionaire, I think Mr. Slaughter is his name, just recently committed $100 million to a new virtual university that will allow a quality education free of charge to anyone in the world. And that's what the internet is going to afford us, that opportunity. So now the question is, are as many people that could take advantage of that higher education going to have the basic skills at their primary and secondary level and the thrust and interest to go on to get the higher degree of learning that will be free to them in a very high quality state? And I think that's what our challenge is, to make sure we don't lose a third of our population or a half of our population, as I said, in the Delta of Mississippi. I mean, if you haven't gone through your sophomore year, you're probably not even literate on a computer, so you can't access the internet, so you're blanked out from that whole opportunity. Now, almost anyone can learn to use a computer and access the internet and have that whole new world open up to you. But it is important that we be very sensitive to the area where that divide exists and make sure that those holes are plugged and they aren't going without. And quite frankly, I'm impressed that we're going to make a leap in education, in development of talent and skill in this next generation that's never occurred in the world before. And we can't even imagine the implications of that huge breakthrough in education. I call it we're in the generation of the second Renaissance. And where it leads us, we really don't know. But that's why I think not only Americans, but the population of the world should be more optimistic today than ever before, because we are actually getting to the point now where everyone will be able to develop their skill, their talent, and their intellect to the highest level of their capacity. And if we do that, and we know everyone has different levels, but then the striving for excellence, for contribution, will be there in its highest and finest order, and the entire society should benefit from that in a big way. But as a parent, if you're a parent of a young child,
you should really have to realize that unless you give the keys to that child to open up themselves to that future world, you're really denying them something that no one should be denied in this day and age. And that's why it's so important, it seems to me, that parents understand that obligation, not only to feed and raise and bring order to a child's life, but also to stimulate them intellectually, to see that they have the aspirations and the focus, and then use the tools that society is giving them, actually free of charge, where a person from the most humble means can be the greatest contributor in the world. And Dara, I know your brothers very well, and this is an example, and I certainly don't want to use them, but I mean, here we have a world-class scientist, a Mark, that's come out of Nanticoke, Pennsylvania, and it's only through the opportunity of our local university system and the attention of his parents to give him that foresight and support system that put Mark and his other brother in those two places. Now, that's where it goes back to how this affects Kings and Wilkes. These are great institutions that offer opportunities that any student at a different level can take advantage of. But they have to also be recognize that we're in such a flexible world of education today that what we thought of as four-year institutions and degree-driven institutions may have changed and may already have changed, where we're able to particularize in a different way the delivery of education and the abilities. And there's going to be, and I agree with the president, a new thrust in life that education will never cease. Even when you win your doctorate, it's really a lifetime tool now that every one of us have to adapt to it. And we have that at our disposal, and we have it at our disposal, or will have it certainly in the near future, free. But it still takes that focus, that attention, that dedication, and that sensitivity, but most of all, the support system, the keys, if you will, to the Golden Kingdom.
Now, one of the issues that you alluded to was a question that I had, and that is, it seems that especially in Luzerne County, with Kings, Wilkes, Misericordia, and the various colleges and institutions, it seems we are graduating people who are incredibly intelligent, and I actually attributed that to the kind of community we were all raised in Luzerne County, where it was a very supportive family community, generations together, stability, and that kind of thing. And what's happened in Luzerne County and in the area, in our listening area, is that those gifted and talented people are leaving. They're not staying in the community. What can we do to help? And this is, I know this doesn't seem like a direct educational issue, but I think it really is, because our gifted and talented go on to win Nobel Prizes. And the gentleman who invented the IV was from Nanticoke and went on to Boston and Texas and other places. And how can we keep those people and keep them within the area rather than having them all leave? What can we do to attract more people?
Well, let me just brag about our area. In the last 3 years, 2 Nobel Prize winners were born and educated in Wilkes-Barre and Kingston. And I talked to both of them. One Dr. Phillips, on a regular basis. Actually had dinner with him not too long ago, and he was educated in the Kingston school system and raised there. And as you indicated, we turn out so many great students. We can't. Sometimes greatness and extraordinary abilities are required to go on to areas where those specialties exist. So they probably couldn't operate or function by remaining home. But the reality is we do lose an extraordinary amount of our very talented students who just seek opportunity, because opportunity doesn't exist all the time in northeastern central Pennsylvania. And what I think we're turning that around, and we are in a big way. I don't think we recognize it, but we're actually now having an inflow of people of extraordinary talent and abilities in so many areas, in research and development and biotechnology, in the advanced glass field, in the advanced composite field. This is starting to happen, but that occurs by creating a new economy and being part of the new economy. And certainly the thrust in northeastern central Pennsylvania is that we're striving for is to get and attract the type of economy
that will be driven by excellence of performance and research and development in other areas. And we're starting to do that. We're having companies now come into the area, and we're developing some local companies to grow into that employment area. But we all belong to a world society, and certainly a national society, and talent has to flow sometimes where talent is necessary, so that you're never going to stop the outflow, nor would you want to, of all your students or graduate students. But on the other hand, we have not yet, but we are soon approaching the stage where we're going to be offering the opportunity economically for our well-skilled and highly educated people to remain in the area and to come back and build industries and businesses within the area, and that's going to be very important. But I get an opportunity to travel throughout the country, and the thing that amazes me the most is the number of people in the highest echelons, CEOs of major corporations, Nobel Prize winners, extraordinary research and development people in national laboratories and some of our finest universities in the country, and they trace their roots right back to northeastern Pennsylvania. So we obviously don't lack the talent and the ability. As a matter of fact, if I had to say anything, I agree with you. So there's something in the culture of northeastern central Pennsylvania and the support systems in the family unit that really encourages our students to excel and do very well. Now, it's our obligation, those of us that are in public office and consider ourselves community leaders, or at least want to be community leaders, to establish a opportunity within the economy of northeastern central Pennsylvania to give our good students and the best and brightest the opportunity to remain home and be part of the community.
Now, we are nonpartisan as far as our program goes here, but I want to talk to you. I'd like to really extend our congratulations to you, because I don't think people really realize, because they don't know the inner workings of government and how things happen, and they certainly don't spend time here. So I want to... One sec. You are listening to Congressman being called to vote. What I was about to say was I think people don't really understand the kind of work that you have done for the area in the years that you have been in Congress, the kinds of industries that you've brought in, the kind of incredible opportunities, more jobs for people, and your constant attempt to make things better all the time, and how that directly relates to education, because, as you alluded to earlier, the more the economy is stimulated, the better the educational opportunities we have, because the bigger the tax base we have for our students. And I want to acknowledge you before I go any further on the kinds of things that you have done for not just Luzerne County, but all the northeastern Pennsylvania. You really keep your state first and foremost in terms of the kinds of things that you are bringing in. I was thinking of the Conservancy and some of the technology that you've tried to bring in. So I really wanted to acknowledge you for, even though this may not seem directly to relate to education, in the end, as you said, economics is directly related to a better education.
That's absolutely true, and that's one of the reasons I'm so involved in economic development. It's not only to create better jobs and better incomes for people, but it really creates a better community, because you it can keep in the area a makeup of the community of all cross talents and abilities, and it makes the area much more mature, if you will, as opposed to just specializing and being limited. And, in a way, again, that's part of the culture of northeastern Pennsylvania. It was an area that was populated to a large extent by immigrants who came for opportunity, and they succeeded very well, particularly very well in raising families. And now a lot of their talented children have had to leave for opportunity. If we can have them come back, or if we can at least keep the children that are now growing up in the area able to stay in the community, but also to develop their talents fully and educate themselves fully and have the quality of life that success would bring in any other area of the country, that is to be competitive with opportunity in our area. That's very important. And we've made great strides in the last decade or decade and a half. I mean, if I ran through the number of people and number of industries that are cutting edge in the world, not only in the nation, in certain technologies, they're right there in northeastern Pennsylvania. They're succeeding very well. They're bringing more people in, and they're growing by leaps and bounds. Now we have to make sure that climate of success in the economic side permeates the educational system. And there is a need for support in education. We have to look at cross use of facilities and faculties and specialists, and we have to be less parochial in thinking of ourselves as individual school districts, but that we are, to a large extent, a very large community in Pennsylvania, the third largest city if we just put Wyoming Valley together, and be competitive in that way. That plays back on the advantages that we'll offer to our children in the future. I think it's going to work out. As I said, I'm more optimistic not only about the world and the nation, but also northeastern Pennsylvania. We're getting there.
And it sounds like you're optimistic about public education as well. I mean, it seems to me that that's part of your focus. I wanted you to explain to people, they often don't understand the integral part of education and society as a whole, and I want to give a little bit of information to our listeners about your thinking on the Nature Conservancy. Why is that beneficial for our children in the future? I think people don't really understand. We were a coal-related industry. I mean, people still refer to the region as the coal region. How is what you are doing as far as the Conservancy related to helping our children for the future?
Well, I'm a great believer that the human personality encompasses everything that they can sense. And if you live in northeastern Pennsylvania and you live anywhere that you have to travel by the remnants of the old coal industry, it can depress you insofar as the environment has been degraded. And you can start to think in a second-class way, not striving for excellence, not understanding that you too are entitled to a high quality of life. And it permeates how you as an individual react in school and in your job and in the community. You start to think you can't get there from here. You can accept second best because you're not entitled to first best. And what we're doing in the Earth Conservancy is we're attacking some of that basic psychological problems. If we can get rid of the scars that aren't only land scars but human scars, because it affects our personality and our view of ourselves and our judgment of ourselves and our own abilities. If we can get rid of that, we can start on a new course, it seems to me, to realize that we are as competitive and as good as anyone in the world and as able as anyone in the world, as indeed we are, if not better. And sometimes I think we're better. But we're going to not only do that in the Earth Conservancy, we hope to eventually clean up the entire coal region from an environmental and land reclamation area. And I think that will remove a lot of the scars that have remained for 100 years in depressing people's objectives in life and goal in life and their certainty of whether they can attain extraordinary success. But the reality is we've developed some of the best businessmen, some of the best businesses, some of the best research scientists, and some of the best inventions the world's ever seen. You know, I'll bet there are very few people listening to my voice right now that realize that Scranton City was the first electrified city in the United States of America. How many people know that? How many people know that Marconi, who is charged with the invention of the radio, well, we had a priest in Wilkes-Barre that was a contemporary and did parallel work to Marconi and was, world class in his greatness. Who would realize that the concept of large low-cost merchandising started in Wilkes-Barre and in Nanticoke in the 5 and 10 cent store. That's where the concept was first invented. Who realizes that the first cable television was installed in northeastern Pennsylvania, or that HBO started in northeastern Pennsylvania? Who realizes that we do our communications on MCI, and MCI is a graduate of King's College. Bill McGowan, and raised and grown up in Ashley, Pennsylvania, became a world-renowned industrialist. So we have so many of these success stories that a lot of us don't even know and don't appreciate, but they all grew out of the culture of northeastern Pennsylvania very successfully. And they also were subject to the scars of the coal industry. If we cover those scars up and we infuse these people with a high feeling of their own personal abilities to succeed, and then charge them up and get out there and
cut up the world, who knows how many more great people we'll produce, not only for northeastern Pennsylvania, but for the world.
You are listening to Children Come First. This is Dr. Daria Brzezinski. We're here today with United States Congressman Paul Kanjorsky from the 11th Congressional District, and we're talking about education and children and other things related to these issues. And I just want to make a footnote about what you were saying. The thing that astounded me the most about coming back, and really coming back every day because I had to drive up and down streets that I hadn't driven in 30 years, were the billboards that talked about the kind of victim mentality that seems to persist around. And I concur with you completely that upgrading the environment definitely has people have a different sense of who they are when the environment around them is very different. And in that regard, let's go back to school buildings. You talked about earlier diminishing class size, and I was thinking, how does that relate to school buildings? If we make class size smaller, then what do we have to do? Now, we have many, many buildings, according to the Department of Health, that need to be upgraded and updated with, as far as health codes go. How are we possibly going to manage with, I mean, even Nanticoke had to build a new school in order to, they had children in motorhomes out back. So how can we possibly diminish the class size? How can we do to balance that out with in terms of the structure of the schools?
Well, I think you're absolutely correct, and it's not only the deterioration of structures, but the fact that sometimes they don't offer the opportunity of new technology to interface with the older school buildings. We're going to have to make some commitments to new buildings and look at whether or not we can join facilities to make them less cost prohibitive, but that's somewhere where the federal government can come in. We are trying to pass a program right now to provide about $25 billion in bonding money for new schools. And our area would be a prime potential for using those types of funds to update, rehabilitate, and rebuild some of its weaker structures along the line. But we just can't replace, and we can't set the standard as it was in 1960. We're now in the 21st century, and we have to strive to modernize, but not just in bricks and mortars, but in concepts. And I think that's where it's important that our superintendents, our school directors start coming together and recognize that there are efficiencies that can be had with alternative learning centers. It doesn't have to be by one school district. It can be groups of school districts, by specialty courses. You're familiar with the use of the internet now in PictureTell, that the school districts can offer 15, 20 foreign languages to students, and they don't have to have that teacher in the school district. They can do it on the internet. And that's very important, so that I have school districts within my congressional district. They're offering Japanese, and it's being taught out of a Bloomsburg classroom, but it's being learned all over northeastern part of the state. And then once a week, they deal with an English class in Tokyo of Japanese students. So it's an extraordinary thing that on a high school level you could get Japanese as a chosen language course, but it's possible now. But that's not a terribly high additional expense. It's just using new means and methods of access and new ways of organizing education. And that can be done on the primary level, the secondary level, and even the college level. And I think that's the challenge to all these educators, that things are changing so quickly and technology changing so quickly, and the need for change in physical plant, but also in their own delivery systems. There are new challenges out there that have to be met with open minds, not with closed minds, and with strive for progress and quality that they're offering to the student. I think that should be our call letter today: quality education for everyone.
Now, do you feel that it sounds to me like what you are talking about is to rethinking the design model of education, if what I'm hearing you say correctly, so that perhaps the design model we have, as far as the 100-plus-year-old structure of core curriculum and teachers in front of the classroom, needs to be really thought differently? It's a twofold question. One is, we haven't in the past rapidly, our institutions of higher learning and government have not changed rapidly enough to accommodate that new way of thinking. For example, technology we know changes every 18 months. A child who goes into community college to get an associate degree in technology, by the time they graduate, their skills are obsolete. So how can we accommodate this quick change that needs to be done in terms of our institutions of higher learning when the hierarchy cannot change quick enough for the demand?
We have to make sure that they recognize the challenge and then are up to the challenge, it seems to me. We're all products of wanting to maintain the status quo once we have penetrated the status quo and are in a certain position. And that goes to every level of life, including educators. One of the most difficult times I have are with the college level educators, trying to have them reconstruct why you necessarily need a degree. Why there are requirements now. We're working with upskilling people in the informational technology area for programming. There's a tremendous need in the country for computer programmers. And the income level starts at probably $60,000 a year, running up to $300,000 or $400,000 a year. In many instances, the person doesn't need a master's or a PhD to be a programmer, or even a college education. They need sometimes very talented technical education. And we don't have schools anywhere in the country that are providing that. So our schools are taking on the challenge to do some of those special new ways. But it's very difficult because the faculty is geared to thinking about a 4-year education for a degree. They're thinking about 9 months school and 3 months off. They think of the cost of the physical plant, and sometimes the physical plant is no longer a factor that can be taken into consideration if you're using internet education delivery methodology. Physical plants that really aren't necessary. So to break them out of, and all of us, including myself, we suffer from the same thing. We don't like to, I'm a lawyer, so you know what lawyers are. They're maintainers of the status quo. What we have to do, it seems to me, is work in every way to break down some of these artificial barriers, particularly cutting the time frame down. I like to think of it as using compression. As you know, that theory in transmission of information is that you can compress material and send it much faster over a line. Well, that's happening as technology interfaces with orthodoxy in education and in community living. And we're not as fast in adapting that orthodoxy to change and compressing it. But the fact of the matter is we have to do that. The world is challenging us to do that. And I think ultimately the educators I meet with, they want to do that, but it's so difficult. It really is difficult. And a lot of times, even when they want to do it, it ends up we haven't even passed the laws necessary to encourage them to do it within an organized society. So we're all a little bit guilty of not living fast enough with this new technology age we're in. But I hope that northeastern central Pennsylvania adjusts sufficiently and fast enough with the rest of the country so